RSJP for putting this on and for doing this important educational and political work on this campus. So today my talk is going to fall into three parts. In the first part I'm going to talk about why any moral person should care about Palestine and be outraged about the injustices that have happened and are happening to the Palestinians. In the second part I'm going to talk specifically about why Americans should care about it. And in the third part I'm going to talk about what should be done. So why any moral person should care. The first thing to note is that when people talk about Palestine and the injustices in Palestine, they're often met with the reply of, well, why aren't you talking about Tibet? Why aren't you talking about the occupation in Morocco? Why aren't you talking about the tremendous suffering from civil wars in sub-Saharan Africa, right? There's a whole number of issues that are brought up and say you're singling Israel out when there's lots of countries in the world that are doing bad things. And it's true, there's a lot of injustice in the world. But I think it's worth noting that when the only time people talk about, say, Tibet, is when they're replying to a Palestine solidarity activist, there's reason to doubt their motives, right? When the only time the occupation in Morocco comes up, when the only time these people are willing to talk about sub-Saharan Africa is when someone has first talked about what's happening to Palestinians, we should doubt their motives and not take it seriously. And when it comes to other problems in the world, when someone starts working on heart disease, when someone says heart disease is really bad, no one says, well, what about AIDS? The double standard is actually applied to Palestine, even as people say that people hold Israel to a double standard. So that's just something to, I think, keep in mind in these discussions. So in thinking about the injustices that are currently happening in Palestine, the way I've divided it is I'll talk about Gaza first, then the West Bank, and then Palestinians who actually live in Israel itself. I'll leave aside the question of the diaspora and the refugees for now. We can get into that in discussion. So Gaza has suffered 3 wars since 2009. Operation Cast Lead in 2009, Operation Pillar of Cloud, and Operation Protective Edge in 2014. In these, several thousand Gazan civilians have died, about 4,000 in these 6 years, and tens of thousands have been injured, and not to mention untold property destruction, devastation to the economy, all of that kind of thing. In Protective Edge alone, I want to talk about just one operation on one day in Operation Protective Edge that gives something of a flavor of what the Israeli military does to Gaza in these kinds of operations. So Operation Protective Edge began in the summer of 2014, in late July, when Israeli planes and artillery began bombarding the Gaza Strip once more. And July 20th, Israeli ground forces entered. And they entered the town of Shujaiya, which is a small town that is right about here off the outskirts of Gaza City, which is one of the major towns. Shujaiya is a smaller town. It's about 2.5 square miles. And to put that in context, that's about the size of like the central ward of Newark. So Newark without the Weequahic or the North Ward or the Ironbound or any of that. So not a big area. It has about 100,000 residents. And on July 20th, Israeli ground forces entered, expecting that they would meet very little resistance and that they would be able to kind of sweep through the city, pushing out the population and controlling the area very easily. But that didn't end up happening. Instead, Hamas fighters had prepared very well for the Israeli incursion and had a series of tunnels that allowed them to engage the Israelis at very close range, which meant that Israel couldn't bring most of its artillery to bear for fear of hitting their own troops. And so Hamas fighters were engaging Israeli troops from distances of like 15 meters away, from extremely close combat. And they were able to inflict some significant casualties on Israel, not in the sense of significant in terms of proportional to Palestinian casualties, but significant in terms of the PR impact on Israel. Because the entire kind of image of the Israeli army was, we're invincible, we'll sweep through, this will be no problem. And so once the Hamas fighters were able to inflict casualties, including blowing up an armored personnel carrier, one of these extremely large armored vehicles that Israel is invading with, it shocked the Israeli military and changed the entire tenor of the rest of the war. Israel responded with intense artillery bombardment as Israeli troops then retreated. They fired 7,000 artillery shells in 24 hours. So think about the central ward of Newark being hit with 7,000 artillery shells, each of them creating an explosion, right, in 24 hours. A US military officer was interviewed for Al Jazeera, and he said, the only possible reason for doing that is to kill a lot of people in as short a period of time as possible. He said that's the kind of artillery response that that the US military would use to cover, I think he said 2 divisions of troops, so a huge number of troops compared to what Israel was actually using this for. Again, an extremely densely populated urban area. And kill a lot of innocent people is exactly what it did. In 24 hours, 65 Palestinians were killed, mostly civilians. And this pattern of overwhelming force in a very densely populated area is what characterized Israeli actions throughout the entire war. So on August 14th, the Israeli military put out an estimate of kind of the supplies it had used in the course of the war. They estimated they had shot 3 million bullets. That's 1 bullet for every person in the Gaza Strip, with 1 million left over. They had shot 3 million bullets. They had used 3,000 tons of ammunition, and they had used 20,000 artillery shells. All right, and then again, a tiny area, right? So, people say Israel's often the size of New Jersey. In this tiny little area, they shot 20,000 artillery shells. And this time, Hamas and other factions within Gaza fired rockets into Israel. They fired about 3,000 missiles. All of these missiles combined packed an explosive charge that was equivalent to about 20 of Israel's artillery shells, to give you some idea of the proportionality of forces involved here. In total, 2,200 Gazans died, with 10,000 wounded. Now the cumulative results of these assaults on Gaza and of the blockade on Gaza, the borders of Gaza are completely controlled. Israel determines who enters. Egypt controls one border, although these days and for a long time, Egypt basically does what Israel says. The result of all of this has been 43% unemployment in the Gaza Strip. Absolutely crushing levels of unemployment. In the last 2 decades, per capita GDP in Gaza has fallen by 1/3. So the amount of money being made in the Gaza Strip per person has gone down by 33% over the last 2 decades. Meaning just absolutely crushing poverty. Construction output fell by 80% after the last war. So all of these buildings that were destroyed, huge areas of Shujaiya, a number of cities in Gaza, were completely flattened. And after the war, construction output has actually fallen. So these areas aren't being rebuilt. They're just flattened neighborhoods, buildings that are crumbling. Now, residents of Gaza aren't starving right now because of the extensive aid that's in Gaza from the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and also the UN. But they nonetheless lead lives of tremendous hardship. Many residents can't leave. Israel won't grant permission to leave the Gaza Strip for things like coming to school in other countries, getting jobs elsewhere. They're trapped within. They can't get work because there are no jobs, right? 43% unemployment. And they live in a totally devastated area that is not being rebuilt, right? Palestinian children get up every day and walk by a building that they saw bombed a year ago. And that building is still crumbling, not being rebuilt. Psychologists have studied this. The situation of children living in Gaza, and they've estimated that 90% of Gazan children are living with a mild to severe PTSD. Right? So this is the situation in Gaza. It's an enormous open-air prison. The borders are completely controlled by Israel, and Palestinians living within live lives of tremendous hardship. Israel has essentially been punishing Gaza since 2006 when Hamas was elected, and they show no signs of letting up anytime soon. Now the West Bank is in a very different situation, and the West Bank in news discourse in the United States is often treated as the good Palestine. Gaza is the bad Palestine, West Bank is the good Palestine, because the West Bank is currently ruled by Mahmoud Abbas, a member of the Palestinian Authority, which is still abiding by the Camp David, or the Oslo Accords, that were established in the early 90s, which I'll talk about in some more detail later, but has essentially maintained a peace treaty with Israel and has refused to engage in armed struggle against Israel, and has actually cracked down very severely on groups within the West Bank that attempt to pursue armed struggle against Israel. It's often said that by supporters of Israel, that if the Palestinians laid down their arms, there would be no more war. Well, if Israel laid down their arms, there would be no more Israel. Well, the West Bank is a very good example of what has happened when Palestinians have laid down their arms. The Palestinian government in the West Bank has not engaged in an armed struggle and has, again, cracked down extremely harshly on groups that have tried. what has happened is that Palestinians have progressively lost control of the land in the West Bank, been subject to increasing Israeli control, and have seen their prospects for statehood, for control over their own destinies, grow ever more remote. This is what has happened since the Palestinians in the West Bank have laid down their arms. Now, to understand this, you have to go back to the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, and what they did is they established a process where Palestinians would begin to have some measures of control over the occupied territories, right, what are called the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank. In 2006, when Hamas came to power, this gets into a lot of history that we can go into in more detail in discussion. Israel tried to foment a coup against Hamas in Gaza. That coup was repulsed, but it had the effect of splitting off Gaza politically from the West Bank. So Gaza and the West Bank are ruled by different Palestinian political groups. In the West Bank, the Oslo Accords are still kind of setting the institutional structure for government in the region, and that structure is one in which there's kind of three levels of control. First, there's Area A, which is entirely under Palestinian administration. Palestinians control both civil administration, so like zoning laws, tax laws, that kind of thing, and they control security, so the police forces are Palestinian, that kind of thing. That's 18% of the entire West Bank. And if you look on a map, Area A is essentially a series of islands that don't connect in Palestine, okay, or in the West Bank. They're clustered around the major urban areas. So, near East Jerusalem, kind of around Hebron, by Ramallah, those areas. That's Area A. And again, those areas are under Palestinian administration completely. Area B is 22% of the total. It's under Palestinian civil authority, but under Israeli military control. So Palestinians can control things like zoning, which is very important because that decides like where new construction can happen, but they don't control the police force. And so when settlers will burn Palestinian farms, attack Palestinian children, all of that kind of thing, the Palestinians as themselves can't actually control their prosecution of these kind of criminal acts. It's up to the Israeli police. And, people in here can probably imagine how zealous the Israeli police are in prosecuting settlers. Not very. Area C, then, is 60% of the total. And Area C is under full Israeli civil and military control. And again, the civil control is particularly important because that means Israel controls what land is zoned for new construction. So when the population grows in a Palestinian village that's in Area C, and people want to build some new homes, want to build new streets for new businesses, that kind of thing, Israel decides whether that's allowed. And most of the time, Israel says no, it's not allowed. And in Area C, Israel is actually actively engaged in pushing Palestinians out, in demolishing homes, in making conditions unlivable for Palestinians in the hope that they'll go elsewhere. And at the same time, this is where the settlement blocks are also really expanding. So just last month, in August alone, Israel demolished 100 homes in Area C in 30 communities, leaving 230 Palestinians homeless. Right, so the Area C, which is the bulk of the West Bank under the Oslo Peace Accords, has been an area in which Israel has increased control, has pushed out Palestinians on a month-by-month basis, trying to make it impossible for Palestinians to live. And the Palestinian villages that still exist in Area C are effectively constricted by the Israeli refusal to allow any kind of new construction. This is what happens when the Palestinians laid down their arms. There's also violence in the West Bank. Israeli violence continues, although not to the extent of the massacres in Gaza. Palestinians, of course, protest against their removal. They try to stop house demolitions. They try to stop soldiers from coming in and arresting people. And Israel responds with violence. So in 2014, 12 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli forces. 47 civilians total were killed, often in these kind of protest actions, trying to stop Israeli soldiers from making life even more unlivable. Currently, 350 Palestinians, most of whom are from the West Bank, are being held in administrative detention, which means they're being held without trial. There are no charges being brought against them. Israel just considers them security risks, and so it can hold them for essentially as long as it wants without bringing charges. And allegations of torture in administrative detention are rampant. If you go online and read about it, you can read about the kind of torture positions that Israeli soldiers use, that they put Palestinians, including children, into. One of them involves tying people's arms behind their back and then lifting the tie up on a chain, leaving people in that position for hours on end. It's called a stress position. That's Israeli administrative detention, which is, again, practiced extensively throughout the West Bank. Now, in the West Bank, it's true, Palestinians live better lives than in Gaza, but Israel still ultimately controls their lives. The peace process has brought peace for Israel, but has actually deepened the occupation for Palestinians who still live in the West Bank. Again, this is what has happened when Palestinians have laid down their arms. Now, finally, inside Israel. Supporters of Israel often claim that Palestinians in Israel live in the only democratic country in the Middle East. They live better lives than Palestinians in other Arab countries, or even Arab citizens of other Arab countries. And of course, it's true that Israel is a comparatively wealthy country, in no small part due to the amount of aid it receives from the United States, which we'll get into a little bit later. But few defenders of Israel would ever tolerate living as Palestinians living in Israel do, even as they say their lives are so great. The Palestinian citizens of Israel live lives that few supporters of Israel would ever tolerate. So let's look at Israeli democracy in the last elections, which happened in March 2015 and resulted in the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu's Likud party won, and he won after declaring in the last days of the campaign that Arabs are, quote, streaming to the polls, and so Jewish voters needed to get out and vote. Now imagine in the United States a politician saying, white voters need to get out and vote because blacks are streaming to the polls, right? That's something you could imagine maybe in 1965, and with some politicians it's maybe too easy to imagine them saying it today. But it's the kind of thing that would be a national scandal if someone said that, and that politician's career would probably be over. In Israel, the politician who said that rules the country. He formed a coalition with the Jewish Home Party, run by Naftali Bennett. And Bennett has said repeatedly he would never give the Palestinians equal rights, which poses something of a problem for defenders of Israel who say, well, Israeli-Palestinian citizens have equal rights. Well, he's saying, I'm not going to give them equal rights. Which sounds like they don't have equal rights. He also said if he ever met Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, he would order Abbas to make him a cup of coffee. He said the Palestinians have little role to play besides servants to Jewish citizens of Israel. In 2013, when he was Minister of the Economy, he said, I've killed lots of Arabs in my life, and there's no problem with that. This is, again, one of the leading politicians in Israel right now. Another member of Bennett's party, Ayelet Shaked, posted this on Facebook before the election. They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall all be on their heads. Now this also includes the mothers of the martyrs, who send them to hell with flowers and kisses. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raise the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. After the election, she was appointed Minister of Justice. So Palestinian citizens of Israel live in a country where that woman is their Minister of Justice, runs the justice system for them. This is Israeli democracy for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinian citizens also face extensive discrimination in the law. Adalah, the civil rights organization in Israel, has documented 50 laws that discriminate against the Palestinians, including laws that govern the use of land. So a huge amount of land in Israel is owned by the Jewish National Fund, which by law cannot be sold to Palestinians, can only be sold to Jews. Palestinian students in Israeli schools receive about 1/3 the funding that Israeli Jewish students receive. And since the founding of Israel, over 600 new towns have been established by Jewish Israelis that are recognized by the state. Not a single new town founded by Palestinians has been recognized, and there are currently